So I was looking at the new Rick Beato video. Today's lyrics are pathetically bad, which I agree with, by the way. But of note in the video was him covering the Beatles song Across the Universe. And in case you've noticed, that song features Indian or rather Sanskrit lyrics, Jai Guru Deva Om. And it got me thinking. Few questions that I'm going to explore in this video. Did the Beatles exploit slash culturally appropriate India? And number two, what does the song Leela have to do with all of this? That's what we're going to get into. So hi folks, welcome back to the Ministry of Guitar. I'm Utkarsh, coming to you from Singapore. If you're watching this and you like this, please do subscribe, it really helps. Now on to the topic on hand. So I started this with a very controversial question, which is, did the Beatles culturally exploit India? I want to answer that up front because this is not clickbait. The answer to that question is a resounding no. But there is a very important significance of the Beatles' trip to India in, I think it was 1968. It's something that a lot of us don't really realize. I would view this entire Beatles episode visiting India, getting influenced by all the different aspects, bringing bits of that into their music, and of course George Harrison in a much larger way. I would view that in a very, very positive light. And I'm going to talk about three things over here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of them going, the Leela connection, which I'm going to tell you about. Then I'll tell you the impact on the Beatles, which a lot of you are familiar with. But what you are not that familiar with is, I think, an overall cultural impact on the world itself and changing a little bit of the way the world was working in a very positive way, in my opinion, from where I'm sitting. So the genesis of them visiting India was essentially Pattie Boyd. Yes, that's the Leela connection. Pattie Boyd, in case you don't know, the inspiration for the song Leela, Eric Clapton's Unrequited Love for George Harrison's wife, there's a whole story there. But at that point in time, she was indeed married to George Harrison. And she was interested in transcendental meditation. In the mid-1960s, the Beatles, or particularly John Lennon and George Harrison, were already developing a latent interest in, expanding their consciousness. They had all been started to use LSD. So they had this interest in expanding their consciousness, a very Vedic, a very Indian idea. George Harrison had already visited India, but then they were looking for something closer to home. And it was Pattie Boyd who found, I think it was an ad in the newspaper about some transcendental meditation movement or some classes in England, which were actually helmed by the Maharishi, the Beatles would eventually go to visit. And that kind of was the starting point for then the Beatles to really get into it and ultimately go all the way to India, go to Rishikesh, which today, by the way, is essentially a place where you can either meditate or you can stone. It's an interesting place, let's just say that. Now, the trip of Beatles to India had many interesting impacts. I mean, in India today, the Beatles are still looked upon very fondly. If you go to that part of India, it's all Beatles. So that's there. It's a very beautiful part of the country. But more importantly, I mean, there was a lot of good music that came out of that particular experience of theirs. I mean, the White Album is, of course, a classic. And I think it definitely changed George Harrison completely. I mean, George Harrison went full on. Again, I'm speaking of this as an actual Hindu, as an actual person from India. So, I mean, George Harrison really integrated himself. Let's just say that. He even named his son Dhani, which I find funny because Dhani means wealth. But it's like literally naming your son Wealth. Would you name your son Wealth Harrison? I don't know. But that's okay. I mean, I'll forgive him that. I mean, he can't have the understanding of what it actually means to that extent, like a native speaker. But fair enough. And of course, everything that George Harrison did later, all the songs, My Sweet Lord, Peace on Earth, if that's the name of the song, a lot happened there. So all of this you already know. Maybe you didn't know the Pattie Boyd story. What I want to tell you is why as an observer of both American, Western, and of course being from India, why I see this Beatles trip in 1968 and the repercussions of that being a dramatic turning point or a pivot for popular culture. So, popular culture in the East and popular culture in the West, I'm using these terms very loosely, were divided. They were very different. So, if you look at popular culture in India, for example, the movie songs or the popular songs in India from the 1950s till the mid 1960s, they were completely divorced from what was going on in the West. And similarly, if you if you look, excuse me, that's my allergies again. If you look at what was happening in the West, if you look at everybody from say Elvis to Jim Reeves, Frank Sinatra, it was very very Western. Of course, Elvis had the whole black music behind it, but let's not digress. That's a different story altogether. What the Beatles did was they kind of melded these two worlds, and very importantly, in the 1960s, this is still just maybe 10 years, 20 years after World War II. This is a time period where you had the huge British Empire, you had the huge French colonies, you had Portuguese colonies, you had Belgian colonies. So there was, from the way I look at it, and again, you can feel free to disagree, there was a very clear sense of that there was a better part of the world and a best and a worse part of the world, and what popular culture could come from this worst part of the world, this conquered part of the world, could not be that great. And I think the Beatles really getting into all the Indian stuff like yoga, which you recognize as yoga, meditation, all of that, all the Vedic thought, and all the music that also came, the sitar and everything, that suddenly opened up the world to think that what's coming from these so-called conquered countries, the former colonies, is not inferior or worse. It's different, and there is something to be had. There is something to be learned. There's something to be known. That attitude, from my sense of reading from the Times, was not there till the Beatles kind of opened it, because the Beatles were it. Beatles were it for Western popular culture. And once they embraced these ideas to differing extents, as we talked, it changed the world in terms of the world's or the Western world's receptivity to other ideas, and similarly for the Eastern world's receptivity even to Western ideas on the flip side. So for India, for example, if you look at some of the songs from the 1970s, you suddenly start seeing the electric guitar coming in. They're not, it's you can see a clear difference. You can even see hippies in a very famous song that you have in India called Dam Maro Dam. It's basically hippie land. So there was that. And for the West, I mean, that opened the door. Today you have bands like BTS, which is of course a K-pop Korean band. You have Squid Games taking over the world. It's a much more global, it's a much more, I mean, of course, recent geopolitics aside, if you look at the world in general, it's a much more open, it's a much more connected world. I mean, I'm literally sitting here from Singapore, and born in India, raised in India, studied and worked in Singapore, living in Singapore. I'm sitting and talking about American electric guitars, and my audience is primarily the US and Western Europe. I have a very little audience in Singapore and in India. That is, this door, this possibility was really opened by, in my opinion, the Beatles embracing these ideas. Now, it can be positive, it can be negative as well. There is cultural appropriation that happens. One of my pet peeves is honestly Lululemon and yoga pants and their campaign. This is yoga. Yoga is how I'm going to keep referring to it because I'm the native speaker. That's cultural appropriation, honestly. As a marketer, also, I don't really like that campaign, but keep that aside. So, of course, there are oversteppings. Now you can have bear yoga and dog yoga, which is nonsensical. It's like having bear CrossFit or a dog CrossFit. But by and large, the world has a better amalgamation of ideas today. And I really think the root of it is that Beatles trip to India. It is potentially that ad that Patty Boyd, Leila, found in her newspaper and decided to take George Harrison to that transcendental meditation class. Yep, this is what I have for today. I would love to hear what you think about it. Sorry, one last note. Pet peeve. Across the universe, my favorite Beatles song. Not because it has an Indian lyric in it, Funny story. I did not know it was an Indian lyric because, of course, it's mispronounced. How can it's different? It's very difficult. I can't speak French. I can't speak Japanese. I can't speak Mandarin. So that's okay. So I just want to say for the record. So how you say that lyric, which is I'm not going to try and do it the way John Lennon does it, but I'll just tell you what is the correct way to say it. It is Jai Guru Deva Om. All right. Till next time.